Good afternoon, everybody. Attorney General Martha Coakley. Everybody all set? With me is our Division Chief Glenn Kaplan. To his left is Assistant Attorney General Amita Singh, and to her left is Assistant Attorney General Aaron Lamb, who are part of the team who worked on this case with Morgan Stanley. We're pleased to announce today a settlement that the Massachusetts Attorney General's office has reached with Morgan Stanley regarding their role in subprime lending in Massachusetts. That settlement is in the amount of $102 million. I'll explain that shortly, but just wanted, by way of background, say that this is the latest in a series of cases that we have undertaken investigating subprime mortgage lending, particularly in Massachusetts. When I took office in 2007, Massachusetts and this country, in fact, were in the early stages of what we now know to be a subprime mortgage meltdown, and the resulting spiral in home foreclosures. Massachusetts was particularly hard hit. Since that time, we have dedicated resources to seeking accountability and understanding of the unfair and deceptive lending that thrived for several years leading up to 2007, but then nearly collapsed our economy. We focused on the lenders that made predatory and unsustainable loans here in Massachusetts, and on investment banks who played a critical role in enabling the unsound lending model to last for so long here. Our office has obtained some groundbreaking results, and today we have a new unprecedented settlement that continues toward the goal of corporate accountability for the subprime crisis. The case and our investigation into Morgan Stanley's role in facilitating predatory lending by New Century was the focus of this, and the settlement today, filed in Suffolk Superior Court, an assurance of discontinuance. In that agreement, Morgan Stanley has agreed to pay a total of $102 million to the Commonwealth and borrowers in the Commonwealth, and has also agreed to structural changes in the way that it does business to make sure that we will prevent this facilitation of unfair lending in the future. Now, as to this investigation, we filed a detailed assurance of discontinuance. We allege the following: that New Century was one of the largest subprime lenders in the country. Morgan Stanley funded, purchased, and securitized New Century loans. Morgan developed an intimate knowledge of New Century's business over time, and they uncovered signals pretty early on that the lending practices of New Century were not sound. Morgan Stanley continued to fund and securitize subprime loans even as New Century's bad loans were causing the lender to collapse, and as we know, they filed bankruptcy fairly early on in the process. Morgan knew because, as part of its business, it had to review New Century's loans portfolio in that relationship. Morgan discovered that New Century was making loans that we allege were designed to fail. They started with low teaser rates, but then they kicked to higher interest rates that borrowers predictably could not afford, and borrowers could only repay by financing. Now, in Massachusetts, since 2008, when the Supreme Judicial Court affirmed a finding in our Fremont case, affirmed a bedrock lending principle that you have to look at the ability to pay the loan for it to make, frankly, good business sense, but certainly to be a fair act under our laws in Massachusetts and consumer protection. As outlined in our agreement today, Morgan Stanley had a number of red flags that these practices were unfair. For instance, Morgan Stanley knew that New Century was using what we call no-doc loans, that is, no documentation, loans without any supporting paperwork, and to the point of abuse. New Century was not following its own underwriting guidelines for these loans, and New Century failed to account for whether borrowers could actually make payments after the introductory or the so-called teaser rates on the loans had expired. Morgan initially refused to fund these loans, but after New Century threatened to pull their business, a Morgan banker approved hundreds of loans that their own compliance team had rejected, and Morgan then softened its oversight to let New Century's business continue. continued to fund New Century and provided the key financing that was needed so that New Century could continue to make those loans. Now, in terms of this agreement, under the assurance filed today in Suffolk Superior Court, Morgan Stanley is required to make payments to its Massachusetts, payments relating to those Massachusetts practices, totaling $102 million, and to adopt new lending and securitization standards. Now, if you look at the chart, we've broken it down for you. $58 million, which includes almost $52 million in principal forgiveness for borrowers, and then $6 million in foreclosure relief for borrowers, will go directly to what has been a primary goal of ours for a while, which is to help keep people in their homes by placing them in a position where they can actually afford to refinance the loan or to pay a new appropriate loan. As a result, the money will be used for this principal reduction, and for instance, a first lien loan will generally receive up to a 35% reduction depending on the property's current value. For example, someone with a first lien performing loan from New Century that had been securitized by Morgan Stanley, around $200,000, that borrower is now having difficulty continuing to pay that loan. Under this settlement, the reduction of the principal of the loan, the unfair loan, would be about $49,000, which will lower monthly payments, which will make that loan, given remaining equity in the home and the income, something that he or she can sustain. Now, in addition to that $58 million, $19.5 million is a payment to the Commonwealth. That will go directly to the general funds in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. $23.3 million, $4 million will go to two state entities that had investments that were, of which the portfolio included such subprime loans. Those include the Massachusetts Municipal Depository Trust, the MMDT, and the Pension Reserves Investment Trust, otherwise known as PRIT, managed by PRIM. These two entities, we allege, and Morgan Stanley by this agreement has given us those funds to restore that amount because the funds included investments in the subprime loans. $2 million of the amounts will go to those individuals who had these loans who have already been foreclosed upon by way of mitigation and relief. Now, this assurance also bars Morgan Stanley from making unfair subprime loans in the future and requires it to use screens and other checking mechanisms to prevent originators of loans from using Morgan Stanley money to make unfair loans in Massachusetts. They're required by the agreement to make additional disclosures going forward, and we believe that those mitigating factors will, at least in the near future, make sure that this kind of behavior doesn't happen again in Massachusetts. The map to the right shows where the cluster of borrowers are located. It's over 1,000 loans, primarily New Century loans that were, again, financed and then securitized by Morgan Stanley. You can see there's a cluster in urban areas like Lowell, Lawrence, Chelsea, Revere, Boston, and Brockton. But there are loans that cover all of Massachusetts, and they will be the beneficiaries of this agreement. Morgan Stanley initially will be responsible for contacting homeowners, but any individuals who believe they may be eligible for this relief can contact our office. The number is 1-888-830-6277. They can visit our website, and we'll certainly be happy to assist people in determining whether they can benefit from this settlement. Now, our investigation revealed that Morgan Stanley backed loans for homeowners that they knew or should have known were destined to fail, and then they failed to disclose the riskiness of those loans to investors.